Jeremy, it's great to have you. Great to have a chance to talk and reconnect. Why don't you start off with just a quick, short introduction, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up at the bedside over 30 years ago, working in outpatient physical therapy, and then followed my dad's footsteps into technology, largely because I realized that some of what was happening in my role in physical therapy wasn't going to scale to the level of impact I thought I could make if I understood technology better and its implications to healthcare. And so for 30 years now, I've been really trying to resolve how do you help the people like I was in physical therapy, like how do you help them be more impactful to each patient or across all of their patients? And so it feels like I've always been this recovering clinician trying to help other clinicians with real, technology impacts that can derive value for them and their patients under their care. And so that's been, 30 years of my life's work so far.
I love it. Good segue, right? Because one of the first things I wanted to ask you is encountering somebody like you is actually really rare, right? Somebody that has a lot of experience building health tech companies from 0 to 1, especially as many times as you have. Um, so I think one of the questions we wanted to ask you was kind of reflecting on that past, right? And thinking through like that journey you've been through on health tech. What are sort of the big opportunities that like continue to motivate you to build like the next things that are down this pathway?
Well, I think like we previously have talked about, you and I think the team really matters. I've been lucky to be as you transition from being at the bedside into really good technology teams, you'd better be a sponge. And I got really lucky to have been around some of the very best teams in healthcare tech and was able to absorb so much. What I would say, given, what you have to do today to go from 0 to 1, especially as fast as technology is evolving, you have to be attentive to the things that make real impact. Um, they're so new today. I mean, we were jailbreaking data out of Epic, 20 years ago, right? There weren't APIs, there weren't large data lakes. No one had tried to figure out how to model anything with machine learning or any kind of AI capabilities. There weren't large language models. Like none of those things existed. So when I get excited about doing anything, from 0 to 1 again, it is always going to be around really good teams.
Mhm.
But it also has to solve real problems in healthcare, right? So you have these new capabilities, especially around natural language processing, large language models, and just access to data that we didn't have 20 years ago. You can do things like really digitize the access points for patients. You can do things like recognize when they're in crisis or about to tip into crisis and crash into an emergency setting. You can understand who you can have an impact value for, meaning like it's one thing to know this person's about to crash into an experience like an emergency department. It's another thing to know that they'll also be compliant with what care you attempt to prescribe. So understanding impact value could be made really simple using the kind of capabilities that are around today. And then because it's always a fear for technologists that are stepping into any kind of role at the bedside or inside of a clinical journey, you have to think through augmenting, not replacing, as your very first move, or else you won't get the kind of adoption that I think we all need if you're going to go from 0 to 1.
Fascinating. A couple of follow-up questions here. I heard you say something earlier around jailbreaking Epic 20 years ago. Tell me about that. That's just sounds like a really fun story.
Yeah, so we could rely only on the things that were available at the time. So like ODBC and JDBC calls were kind of state of the art at the time. And so you had to figure out like, well, okay, what do you make a call into and how do you understand what the dictionary is of the data set? And then how do you get payloads back? And then how do you make sense of those payloads? I mean, that was the state of the art at the time, and we were good at it. And so, you found a way to start evolving what that really deep platform could give you as data, and then you figured out how to get other components to work in a similar way. And what we got good at was really sort of digitizing small portlets inside of a portal where you could say, this is the patient, Jeremy Powell, and I have all of these, lab results or pieces of data from 15 different applications now at a single piece of glass. and no one was doing that at the time. And so we were building unified records from disparate data sets, except there was no API to do it. And so we kind of figured it out.
That's hilarious because it's still a problem.
Yes, right.
It's still a problem. I'm
That's
not
why I
sure.
love
Like,
that's why I love what you guys are doing, right? If you can find a way to I mean all the things that are versions of digitized paper that are in healthcare still, like if you can find a way to make that incredibly valuable, you don't have to rely on somebody else's door like to let you into the data, which is great.
the other thing that you said that really caught my attention, because I mean this is strong product methodology around like sort of first foot in, toe in the water, understanding adoption risk over engagement risk, things like that. But I heard you say sort of augment versus replace, right? As
Mhm.
sort of the initial like thing to be paying attention to. Help me understand a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I've always, I mean, I've sat on panels for a while where, you know, I was sitting adjacent to a Wells Fargo person who was running all the pilots for, you know, what were going to be natural language processing and large language model support. And they had 100 pilots going on at the time. And so when you sit in that space where technology is really trying to find its footing, we were always talking about like how do you ensure that what you're doing really is in the first few steps helping a current process, so that it can be understood so that you then can have that land and expand opportunity. At least that's been my experience for 25 years, is that often if you come straight at the problem with, hey, we're going to take out, this whole way of working and shift it from one day it was this to another day it's binarily something else.
Right.
Most people can't see that. I mean, Steve Jobs is a perfect example of someone who saw what the future was going to be, but largely couldn't get the rest of the world to marry into his mindset, and had to sort of go at it in piecemeal, but he sort of knew the endpoint. I think you have to know your endpoint, but you also have to realize that people aren't going to move at the same pace that you are. And so you need to be able to think through, like, how do I get adoption through augmentation before I do anything that might replace an entire process in healthcare?
Having been inside healthcare and looking out. So one of the questions I'm always sort of curious to hear people's takes on is like whether or not the lived experience for that adoption curve or the rate of change curve, or like people's temperament to change their behavior, whether or not it truly is slower or harder inside healthcare than it is in other industries. A, is that true? And B, if so, like to what degree do you think that is?
I mean, I think there are examples where you can see this happen without it being so forecasted, but healthcare doesn't have some of the things that other markets do. Like we're not an actual an ecosystem that has pricing, and you can't rely on things that markets typically do, right? There, how much does your healthcare cost? Like making it retail or consumer focused has been a thing we've talked about for 2 decades, but it doesn't happen. So some of the things that naturally evolve retail or other, other finance, fintech, any of those other markets just don't exist in our space. So um, things that you could do in any other space where money and adoption was just going to be so obviously captured because the markets work the way they do. We don't have that in healthcare. So you have to understand that the power structure is between the patient and the provider, and that anyone that can get into that very sacred setting has to serve all parties. And in some cases, especially if we talk like we do often about advanced illness care, the
Right.
unit of care isn't just the patient and the provider, it's the families included. So it's the patient, the family, and the provider. And you have to treat that as sacred. I mean, health plans have been trying to get into that space for decades. It's a really, really difficult door to pierce. It's a really sacred environment to work within. And then the power structure shifts between those two persons, especially as they go through the last chapters of life. You may start with the clinician sort of being the lead role, but over time, decisions about end of life care switch to the patient and then eventually switch to the family. And so there's a lot you have to care for in that world that we just don't think about in retail or fintech.
Yeah. I've been through that a few times, and the dynamic is very unique, certainly.
It is.
And the other thing that caught my ear is sort of your initial answer around like the the influencers or motivators that are typically price driven or market driven just don't occur in healthcare. I love that I love that answer, right? Because sometimes when I ask that same question to other individuals, the answer I get back is it's more about the regulatory system rather than the lack of the financial, right? Like sort of motivators or influencers. So it makes total sense. I love it.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, if you think about like what shifted healthcare the most, it was the relaxation of being able to get things during COVID that you didn't have a price for, that there was a regulatory component like opening up virtual visits and having those be paid for, but that accelerated so much good. Because finally it was like, okay, we can let go of our historic, like we're going to control things through the regulation, or because we don't have this payment methodology that drives traditional market movement. It
right.
was like, okay, there's this thing we haven't seen in 100 years. Let's relax everything. And I think that was what it took to really sort of lever change in healthcare at the speed we saw.
Let's switch gears here a little bit because naturally, given the domain that Keebler has been in risk adjustment, yours in having this depopulation health experience, I think I want to take us there for a little bit
Mhm.
and kind of think through, you know, from your perspective, especially in that advanced illness and high acuity population demographic. Like, how do you think risk adjustment and pop health really complement one another, especially in light of some of the changes that are happening, like the technology landscape, or the technology enablement landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should redefine risk stratification. So, you know, if you think about like a healthy Med Advantage is a fairly healthy population,
Right.
all things considered, right? So the way they're going to look at risk is more actuarial. You can use any number of models to sort of figure out like how's my population going to do over time. I think what we're working on here and what I think the value to advanced illness populations has more to do with understanding like we talked about a little bit before, like if I have a patient who's not been compliant historically and they're, you know, a double amputee smoking while on oxygen, like the needs they have are through the roof, but your ability to reach them is very low. Like you need to understand that that's a different patient type. So that's one aspect. They may not take your advice into consideration and be very compliant with care. So that's a kind of risk you need to understand. There are other kinds of risks that I think exist in the advanced illness population that have to do with what sort of impact are they going to have when the system has its hands on them. There are many perverse incentives that exist inside of the healthcare ecosystem where a person who is an advanced illness candidate managing multiple disease, issues, lots of burden. The system wants to wrap their arms around that patient because there's a lot of billable events that can occur. And I think you need to recognize that you need to be able to stratify the risk down to like how likely is this patient to admit, to readmit, to have an ICU stay, to have a long-term care stay. And then if you knew those things, how do you turn that knowledge into something that a patient carer, someone that's either a navigator or even at the point of care, can act upon that knowledge in a new and differentiated way. Because today, most of those patients are seen by people that see a wide variety of patient types, and they could, mistakenly think this is every 78-year-old female, and it's not. There's a nice bell-shaped curve even in the advanced illness side. So being able to really understand first what level of insight you can provide with a tool, and second, how to make it useful such that they can ask better questions, have a better encounter, and potentially drive the kind of impact that doesn't have them crash into an emergency or an ICU stay, where again, all these perverse incentives go into work on that patient because there's real money to be made in those kinds of journeys. I think that's the work we get to do.
I love it. Love it. Um, I think that's a good segue, right? 'Cause thinking holistically around work, right? Over the course of your career, I would say you've seen, I don't know, tens of thousands, right? Of individually relation, or you've built up tens of thousands of relationships with payers, providers, just everyone within our ecosystem. Um, Given sort of your unique perspective on being a health technology entrepreneur, I'd be curious to know what you think uh, that demographic, this set of people like you and me, health tech entrepreneurs, like what are we doing well, right, for this ecosystem right now? What are some gaps that we're leaving?
What I hope we're still doing well is being very hard-headed. You have lots of people in the healthcare ecosystem that are going to tell you it won't work. That's not how it's done. You don't understand. And that is true. I think the status quo is there are many voices to protect it. So the first thing I would say is I hope that we're all still trying to tilt a lot of windmills so that the few of us that make it to the promised land of lots of success really continue to challenge the thinking that's been around for 50 years. The other thing that I would say is on the other side of that, ideas aren't what's cool. Like technologies themselves aren't what's cool. The only thing that I think is cool is adoption. And if you celebrate the collaboration and that augmentation step with your provider teams that are that help you with the design elements, that help you as development partners, it's these complexities you can understand that have often been almost pushed down on them from the status quo. That's the hinge upon which I think success will swing for you. And I think again, having your sense of I know what's potentially right here, and then having this real like thirst for adoption and partnering inside of the ecosystem today. Like if you can start to automate things that augment the care delivery, they will literally lead you at a much faster pace to something that provides real and immediate adoption. So be maniacal about what you believe, and then be maniacal about really collaborating with the folks that are inside of these sacred areas.
I love it. Wisdom well taken. Uh, we always ask this one. Everyone who we speak to and record, we ask this one question. Given the community that we have access to, that we're sort of broadcasting around here, like I'd be curious to know if there's a question that you want to ask the audience, right? See if they'd be willing to contribute and answer.
Yeah. So I was lucky at one point in my career to get asked this question, so I've carried it around for a long time. And maybe I'll ask it of you and put you on the spot, or you can ask them and get a number of answers from them. But the question is, if you had a magic wand and unlimited resource, like what would you bring to life in healthcare? And if it's helpful, I have an answer. I've always thought at the advanced illness end of the spectrum, most people are so shook up emotionally about the loss of a loved one that they're not going to read books or even watch videos. But at 3 a.m. in the middle of a sleepless night, they sure would like to be able to get either on a phone call or have a chat or some sort of connection to an interdisciplinarian, someone who's got like chaplaincy or social worker or nursing or physicians sort of backgrounds or backstopping them, and having a conversation about what do I do from here. And I think, again, I'm not sure that's a business, but man, that would certainly be helpful to all the daughters. Most of the United States, the oldest daughter takes care of mom or dad through their last chapters of life. All the daughters that are sleepless night, managing their own work lives, their children, having this backstop would be an amazing thing.
Yeah, as you're sharing that, it's resonating, right? Given one of the experiences my family went through. Um, uh, it's funny when you ask that question. I actually take it in a different direction, right? A little bit more
Sure.
meta. All right, my head initially went to sort of something earlier you had mentioned as a part of our conversation around this idea that like traditional market adoption sort of rules don't apply because the market, financial market incentives and you know uh, powers and pressures don't exist inside healthcare.
Mhm.
Right. And part of the reason why we got into Keebler was because I ran into a price transparency problem, right? And
Right.
I had this sort of recognition early on that like if I had the price transparency at the degree that I really wanted it, like that crystal clarity to see how everything moved and you know was tied to what was something that I would have to personally experience, it would help me sort of better predict or understand how to take care of myself.
Yep.
And without that information, I always say, like even in product, I would say if, more often than not, we're just operating without enough information, right? You're
Yep.
forced to make decisions that are critical, long-term, high ramification decisions or high consequence decisions without enough information, right? Price transparency is one of those things that I think that would be really, really powerful. And it would open up, I think, I would hope, right, some of the ability for that financial market conditions or market pressures to help sort of establish, if you can't tell, I'm I'm a capitalist.
Yeah, sure.
And have this core belief that financial conditions, financial incentives can drive change for good. Um, is that the one silver bullet? Probably not, right? Would that increase the ability for unexpected outcomes, right? Like exploitation in other using ways? Probably, right?
Right.
But could it be
Right.
better? Would it be better? I think so. And in many ways, I actually think it's a story of value-based care, right? It's like, how do you tie patient outcomes to financial
Yeah.
outcomes and make sure that the at least the alignments, right, for everyone winning when somebody stays healthy is correct, right? And that's what excites me about sort of the work that we're doing. Um, I think if I had to take it even one step further beyond that, right? I don't think the single payer model in and of itself is like the correct or right model. The
Mhm.
element that I really enjoy seeing as part of the rest of, outside of even the United US healthcare system is this idea that like um, the people who are establishing or responsible for the healthcare are also fully accountable for the outcomes of that patient's health, right? It's like it really is this intimate tie together, right? And value-based care is like close, right? It's a little bit better, right, than what we have now, but it's not quite as merry, right? And I think that's what's like in every other, I would say, technology, business, market, software products, right? Entanglement, like those are pretty typically entangled, right? The
Yeah.
responsibility or the accountability for what you produce yielding a valuable outcome for your user or your individual that is going through that value exchange. And that isn't the case for healthcare, and it's really sad.
Yeah. I
Um,
agree.
that's
I
what I'm
hope
trying to change.
I hope you keep tilting at that windmill. The one I tilted at forever that's in this space is that a point of care clinician makes decisions 80 to 90% of the time without data that's readily available. It's just too hard to find. Like
Right.
it's digitized. It's just not at his,
It's
it's
not
not at the
there.
glass. Yeah. It's not
Yeah,
at the glass when he needs it. Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty wild. I
Yeah.
also like your Don Quixote
Yeah.
reference.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
I love it. Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time to record this conversation with us. I hope
Of
it
course.
is well received by our larger community.
Well, it was fun to do, and I hope like you that it does land.